Good evening. Thank you all for coming. Those of you students who have an incentive to come, and those of you who are here with slightly more free will, we welcome you all. I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West. We have our Brookings Scholar Lecture tonight. And tonight, we're going to fix the US Congress, right? Or at least we're going to try. And you're going to hear from our colleague, John Hudak, who has an interesting approach to that idea. John has his undergraduate degree from the University of Connecticut and his master's and PhD from Vanderbilt. He's a student of the federal government, and I made a serious mistake by not bringing down your book that I wanted to do a commercial for. All right, you can do your own commercial, great. An unsolicited comment, I recommend it highly. Not paid to do that. We hope you'll engage John with some questions as he presents his information. We'll be back for the Q&A after John has a chance to discuss his thoughts with you.
Great.
John?
Well, thanks everyone for coming. As Bill said, those of you who are not here necessarily by choice, I hope that I'll be at least a little bit entertaining to make the hours go quickly before you run out and grab a beer afterwards. So, which I also recommend. I recommend my book and you grabbing a beer afterwards as long as you're 21 or over. Okay, so as Bill said, I'm going to talk about fixing the US Congress. And one way to do it that I recommend, obviously by the title, is through earmarks. Now it's not a secret that Congress is broken. I work in Washington, D.C. I study these issues pretty fiercely, and everyone always asks, is there a path forward? Is gridlock going to end soon? Is there any resolution in sight? And the answer is no. But if we transition back to earmarks, there might be some really important changes for federal policymaking, for politics in general, for states like Nevada, and our relationship with political actors and our elected representatives in general. That might change and improve for the better. So let's get started. So in 2010, most of you know, Republicans won back the House of Representatives after a 4-year period of being in the minority. And part of that success, part of their electoral success in 2010 was due in part because of the rise of the Tea Party, a segment of the Republican Party that rose up angry about the expansion of government into healthcare, the stimulus law, and President Obama's agenda in general. And so in 2010, shortly after the election in November, the Republicans got together to elect their leadership, to talk about what their priorities would be in the new Congress. And one of their priorities was to eliminate earmarks. They said, this is causing us a tremendous amount of trouble. They wanted to reduce spending, reduce deficits, reduce corruption. They saw earmarks as anathema to the American system and to daily politics and policy. And in 2011, when the new Congress took over in January, they made good on their promise. They banned earmarks. They said that no longer would the practice be allowed in the Congress. And it was the greatest thing that happened to President Obama. And part of the reason for that is that it didn't get rid of the money to spend. It just took care of who spent it. No longer did Congress have the authority to say, we need $1.5 million there, or we need $100 million there, or $50 million there for different projects in their states and their districts. Now the bureaucracy would do it exclusively. The executive branch would do it exclusively. So what it did was it transferred power from Congress, from Republicans in Congress, to a Democratic president. So ironically, the motivation here was to do something about the new Congress, motivated in large part by a resentment and an unhappiness with President Obama. Their first action was to help him out. It was generally a Republican-led effort, as I said. It did not happen during the Democratic Congress, though there were conversations about it under Speaker Pelosi. But it did not come to fruition until after the 2010 elections, as I said. And it was spearheaded by a lot of the Tea Party members who were newly elected, a lot of the existing representatives and senators, Republican senators and representatives in Congress who adopted Tea Party values, who aligned themselves with the new Tea Party. But there was also bipartisan support and opposition. There were Democrats like Claire McCaskill, a senator from Missouri, who was a staunch opponent of earmarks, who felt that a ban was much needed and that she was in favor, at least during the debate, she was in favor of it. There was also opposition among Republicans. There were a lot of Republicans who have had a lot of success in Congress by engaging in earmarking. Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader from Kentucky, there are a lot of things in Kentucky named after him. Strom Thurmond, the late Strom Thurmond, who until recently was the longest serving member of Congress in history, the senator from South Carolina. If you go to Columbia, South Carolina, is anyone here from South Carolina? Oh, good. Well, that's all for your benefit. Everything in Columbia, South Carolina is named after Strom Thurmond because he was a master of pork, and while he was a Democrat for some of his career, he was a Republican for the rest of it. Republicans like pork. They like earmarks. A lot of them do, at least. And so there were these divisions over these issues. Part of them were legislative. Part of them were Republicans just wanting to continue this practice, wanting to be able to reap the benefits of earmarking. But at the same time, there were constitutional concerns. The constitutional concerns arise generally out of Article 1 of the Constitution, which grants Congress its power, and it grants Congress the spending power. And there were many people in Congress who said, we need to keep this. This is constitutionally our power. This is constitutionally what we are charged to do. Our founding documents tell us we have to do this. We should continue doing this. And the irony is, one of the biggest opponents of the earmark ban was one of the most conservative senators in the United States, James Inhofe from Oklahoma. One of the most conservative senators from, by almost any metric, the most conservative state in the US. He was opposed to earmarking. Now, he's not someone who likes spending. He's not someone who likes deficits. He's a deficit hawk. But he was opposed to this. So here are some quotes from a Politico article. His words from the Senate floor are much more pointed. So an across-the-board spending ban has the unintended consequence of eliminating useful spending. What he's saying is that not all earmarks are created equal, and not all of them are bad. There are really good ones. He's engaged in it. His colleagues have engaged in it. And sometimes there's waste, sure. But sometimes they're funding really important projects. Projects you might not even realize are pork. The interstate highway system, grown out of both defense, transportation, and transportation needs for commerce in the 1950s. The Eisenhower administration saw this as a really important part of growing American commerce, growing the American economy. But where those roads ended up had a lot to do with earmarks, had a lot to do with pork, had a lot to do with where powerful senators and House members were coming from. Very few people think the interstate highway system in the United States was wasteful spending, but it was loaded with pork. He goes on, to be clear, there are many earmarks that should be defeated. This is the wasteful spending, but we should defeat them based on their substance. What he's asking for is a conversation about earmarks, not a black or white, yes or no, 1 or 0, but a more fluid, more dynamic conversation. And that's what good public policy is. That's what good policy making is a detailed, informed, robust conversation, not just a simple ban or a simple acceptance, but making it more detailed and more important. And finally, here's where the Republicanism shows through at its best. Instead of ceding Congress's constitutional authority to the president, we should hold Obama accountable and be responsive to our constituents. He was angry about the stimulus bill. There were supposedly no earmarks in the stimulus bill, though there actually were quite a few. But the goal of the stimulus bill was to be earmark-free. And Republicans were angry about how the stimulus law ended up being administered, although most assessments of it, most unbiased assessments of it suggest that it did do quite a bit of what it was intended to do. There was pork in the bill, a little bit from Congress, but a whole lot from the administration. And Senator Inhofe saw what this was. This was a constitutional transfer of power. It was not a power grab by President Obama. There's a lot of discussions of that, his use of executive orders and other executive actions, regulatory actions, a whole host of behaviors that this president has that Republicans accuse him of power grabbing. That's not what happened here. Here, Congress willingly gave President Obama extraordinary power over federal funding by giving it up, by giving up their own power. So So here's a little overview of the talk. First, I'm going to discuss the politics and policy of earmarks, what the value of earmarks are, and then talk a little bit about the fallout, the consequences of the earmark ban. Specifically, what the earmark ban means for Nevada, and then some concluding remarks, including a prescription of how we move forward in this way. So a little brief history of earmarks. The tradition is as old as the Republic. President Washington engaged in earmarking. Now, back then, the serious nature of earmarking was, $1,800 to help a port. But it's existed since the 1780s, since the early 1790s. Earmarking has been part of American politics. It also exists at the local, state, and federal levels. Mayors do this, governors do this, state legislators do this. It happens in this state, it happens in every state. And it of course happens at the federal level, whether it's Congress, whether it's the president, whether it's both. The New Deal marked a new era for the United States in a lot of ways, but it really had a substantial effect on federal spending and the ability of Congress to earmark. What the New Deal did was expanded the size and scope of the federal government in an unprecedented way. It made the federal government not simply an institution that dealt with foreign policy matters, which for 150 years, that was its main purpose. Now it had an expanded role in domestic policy. And with that came tremendous amounts of federal spending as we spent our way out of the Great Depression. But it also gave Congress and President Roosevelt the opportunity to figure out where money would go, what benefits that money and the targeting of that money would have. And so one of the New Deal projects were planned communities. We created these planned communities as a way of providing housing and safety and neighborhoods and community, all the types of ideas that at the time sociologists and economists felt was a positive way to deal with existing social and economic problems and to lift people out of what was not just an economic depression, but in many ways a psychological one as well. Well, planned communities didn't just get assigned to the areas that needed them the most. They got assigned to where there were very powerful congressional interests. And there were a lot of programs in the New Deal during the Eisenhower administration with the, as I said, creation of the interstate highway system, in the Kennedy administration during the Great Society under President Johnson, later in the 1980s as we expanded our defense capacity under President Reagan, the allocation of defense funds, the opening of new military installations. That had a lot to do with pork in earmarking as well. And so as government grew, more opportunities rose up, and Congress gets addicted to it. They really enjoy earmarking because they see a lot of benefits. But then the conversation began to change. In the mid-2000s, as Republicans became a little bit disenchanted with President George W. Bush and the expansion of government under him, particularly in areas, in areas of homeland security, as the new department opened and grew and had substantial impact and had a lot of federal funding flowing to states and localities, this gave pork barrel opportunities for a lot of people, for a lot of areas, on an issue that people thought should not be politicized, the defense of the homeland, the safety of our citizens. And the conversations began to change about maybe we should get rid of earmarking. And that conversation, as I said earlier, was among Democrats. It was also among Republicans. And so earmarks became vilified, and not just among elected officials, but among the public as well. And that's an important point that gets us eventually to an earmark ban. So what's the purpose of earmarks? First, it's a way for elected officials to target funding for local concerns. The idea being federalist in nature, in that local communities, states, congressional districts, counties, municipalities, they understand what they need, and they can communicate with Congress, their elected officials in Congress, about those needs in an effort to get the funds, the support that they want, that they sometimes need, sometimes don't need. It's also a way to employ, as I say, legislators' understanding of public needs. Some senators don't represent many people. Senator Tester in Montana represents about 500,000 people. Senator Feinstein in California represents 39 million. Even in a small state like Montana, it's hard to understand all of your local needs. But it's a lot easier for Senator Tester to understand what Montana needs than President Obama to understand what Montana needs. And so the idea of congressional earmarks is that as these elected representatives are closer to the people and closer to the problems and have staff in every state, in every town, in some places many towns, and in congressional districts, that flow of information is very helpful and it helps target those funds. In terms of the brass tacks of politics, it also gives Congress what political scientist David Mayhew calls a credit claiming opportunity. It allows Congress, members of Congress, to engage in pork barrel politics, engage in earmarking, and say to their constituents, see what I did for you? I got you a new firehouse. I got you a new road. I got a new terminal at the airport for you. Re-elect me. And what David Mayhew calls the electoral connection is this relationship between what Congress does and how the public perceives it, and the ability of members of Congress, incumbent members of Congress, to use their position to advance their electoral interests. And that's absolutely a part of earmarking. It's also a means, as I discussed earlier, of restraining executive power. If you ban earmarks, it doesn't make the money go away. It just makes the power go away for the individual banning the earmarks, for the Congress. But earmarks are also associated with corruption. There can be kickbacks for elected officials, for interest groups, for other interests, business and otherwise. There can be self-serving earmarks. There is an example in Illinois of where a new airport was installed that was very close to the home of the congressman who sits on the Committee of Oversight over this funding. And so there can be self-serving earmarks for sure. And those are problematic. There are also, and this is a little bit less about corruption, but there are advantages within each chamber. Who has the power to earmark? Who's more effective at earmarking? That has a real impact on basic questions of fairness and equity and basic questions of spending. So, in a little bit more on the politics of earmarks. As I said earlier, there are two types. There are congressional earmarks, there are presidential earmarks as well. Congressional earmarks make their way into public policy either by inserting them directly into bills, directly into legislation through the bill process, through amendments that are proposed during the legislative process, through committee reports where they make recommendations to executive branch agencies that money should be spent in certain ways and certain amounts in certain areas. And that provides the distinction between formal and informal earmarks. Formal earmarks being explicitly written into the letter of the law, into the legislation itself. In informal earmarks, as I said, which was the latter, these unspoken, although written, expectations that the executive branch do what Congress wants it to by putting it in a committee report. So why would the executive branch do this? Well, the Congress has oversight power. And so if the executive branch doesn't honor congressional earmarks, they can launch investigations, they can ask for more reporting, they can ask for appointees to come up to the Hill for testimony. They can make lives within federal agencies a real hell. And so it ends up being a quid pro quo between Congress and the executive branch to engage in an informal earmarking process. Presidential earmarks have a lot of people who influence them. There's White House influence about where money goes, when it goes there, and who benefits. The White House influence being not just the president, but the Domestic Policy Council, the Office of Management and Budget, and others within the White House, as well as appointees. Most people don't truly understand the reach of the president. They do, of course, understand his foreign policy power and his domestic policy power, but the president has a lot of appointees, almost 4,000. Almost 4,000 people have a job in Washington because the president wanted them to. Most of those appointees don't require Senate confirmation. Several hundred do, 700 or 800 do. But most of them don't. The president or an agency head signs a form and you're an appointee. They're everywhere. They're in almost every federal agency. And in some agencies, there are a lot of them. And in a lot of agencies, particularly ones that are funding centered, appointees have the final say over these types of policies, in this case, this type of spending policy. So presidents can wield quite a bit of power. So who benefits? Senior members, senior members in Congress, in the House and in the Senate, do quite well. They've established institutional power. They have the ability to know well how the process works. They know everyone. They know essentially better than everyone how to work the system, like you would in a business, like you would in a household. It works like that in Congress too. Small state senators, they do quite well. Vulnerable incumbents do well, party leaders, committee chairs. The public benefits from earmarks. This is money going to fund public projects, projects that people get value, get utility out of. And I assume everyone in the room knows this map. It's Corridor H in Appalachia, connecting the booming metropolis that stretches from Elkins, West Virginia, all the way to Wardensville, West Virginia. In reality, what this road is a series of roads, bridges, tunnels through the mountains of Appalachia, connecting western West Virginia with eastern West Virginia. This is a real effort to improve the economic mobility of people in West Virginia who suffer quite a bit. It is no mistake that Robert Byrd was the senior senator from West Virginia. For a period of time, he was the most senior senator in the Senate. He was House Majority Leader at one point and one of the most effective earmarkers in the history of the Congress. I was telling a story to John before the talk. One of the most remarkable things you would ever do, this was until, it's still largely the same, but it was more so when Senator Byrd was still alive. You would drive from Pennsylvania to West Virginia, which I don't recommend. But you would drive from Pennsylvania to West Virginia, and as soon as you crossed the state line, the roads were beautiful. It was like driving on, I don't know, you can't say ice, it's not driving like on ice, but just it went from bumpy and rocky to smooth roads. The roads in West Virginia were always great because Senator Byrd made sure they were always great. Now, other states needed roads paved, Pennsylvania for instance, but this is not it, but there are major commercial road routes through West Virginia that bridges and tunnels and paved roads really helped commerce in ways that affected the East Coast, the Midwest, and the West Coast as products are transported across the country. And so roads like this, which have been under construction for 40 years and will almost certainly be under construction for another 40 years, really have value. But this doesn't get built in a state with 2 freshman senators, 2 junior senators. This gets built in Robert Byrd's home state or Strom Thurmond's home state. Who benefits from presidential earmarks? Swing states definitely do. Key constituencies of the president, home states, policy constituencies that the president cares about, and me, because I get to write a book about it, which I recommend all of you buy. It's available at Amazon.com for not a bad price. And it talks a lot about where federal funding goes when the president is in charge of it. What my book, and I promise I won't belabor this point, what my book focuses on is that swing states get a lot more federal grant money than non-swing states when the decisions over those grants are decided within federal agencies by appointees of the president. So when you take that money away from Congress, that power rather, away from Congress, it doesn't get rid of politics. It doesn't get rid of earmarking. It doesn't get rid of political forces rather than just basic policy need influencing who gets what and when. It just determines who does that. And in this case, it's the president and his appointees. And so I have just a different perspective on how we move forward with earmarks. And I'm going to get to that. But first, what earmarks are not? They're not automatic budget growers. Some people think they are. If we have earmarks, the budget gets bigger. That's not necessarily true. It can be true. But what earmarks at their basis do is they don't expand the pie. They just determine how that pie is cut up. Now, you can get into an earmarking process in which you just start piling money upon money upon money upon money, and then your budget grows. But oftentimes what happens is there's a chairman's mark. That is a dollar amount that the chairman of a committee determines will be the funding level for the agencies under his jurisdiction, usually an appropriations subcommittee chair. And then you start divvying up the funds. I'll take $1.5 million, you'll take $200 million, this and that. So it doesn't automatically grow the budget. And related, it doesn't automatically grow the deficit. In fact, there's very little relationship between earmarking and federal deficits. They're not automatically corrupt. They can be, but they're not. They don't automatically create waste, fraud, and abuse. They can, but it can happen no matter where that money's being spent. It's not something unique or specific to congressional earmarks. And earmarks are not bad for America. In a lot of ways, they're very good for America because they realize and they take into account local concerns in the distribution of funds. And it's not to say that presidents don't do that, and it's not to say that bureaucracies don't do that. But what a bureaucrat in Washington in the Department of the Interior knows about what the needs are within a specific community in Nevada or Utah or Washington is a bit different than what the representatives and the senators from those states understand. So, I think everyone should embrace pork. That's what I think is the path forward, because there's some real benefits. There's some real costs too, but there's some real benefits. One of them is democratic. There's a democratic value to earmarks. As I just said, there's a responsiveness to local concerns. That's something that is absolutely part of our fabric as a republic and a democracy. That the government, the central government, is responsive to what people need, and in the delivery of services, and in the delivery of goods, and in the delivery of funding, public policy responds to need, and local need, not just federal need. It connects, in that way, it connects the public to their legislators. The public has an ombudsman, has someone they can go to, so that the enormous federal government can work for them like it's supposed to. It can overcome bureaucratic challenges. I don't think anyone in this room has any misgivings about taking power away from bureaucrats. They can do really good work, and they can do really lousy work. This helps overcome some of those challenges. Not all of them. The funds still get administered by bureaucracy. But in the determinations of who gets what, earmarking can overcome some of those challenges. And as I said earlier about what David Mayhew calls credit claiming, it allows voters to assess their elected officials. It gives them another metric on how effective they are, about how connected they are, about how much they care about their district. There's a really important US Senate race going on right now in Kansas. It might actually determine the balance of power in the Senate. Pat Roberts, who's been in the Senate for quite some time, he's running for re-election. Initially, he was running against a Democrat and an independent. The Democrat dropped out. And now an independent, who leans a little bit Democratic, though he hasn't said whether he'll join Democrats or Republicans if he's elected, is far ahead of not far, but he's several points ahead of Senator Roberts in polling. One of the problems that Roberts faces, now he's a conservative Republican in Kansas. That should be easy for him. He's been there for several terms. He hasn't had much competition in the past. Republicans control every statewide office. They control both houses of the state legislature with enormous majorities. This shouldn't be a challenge for Senator Roberts. The problem is Senator Roberts doesn't live in Kansas. He lives in suburban Washington, D.C. He's disconnected with his state, that's the charge, because he's not there. He doesn't have that local interest. Now, he does help Kansas out legislatively as much as legislation still gets passed. But voters are assessing him based on the metrics that they see. And what they see is that his checks get mailed to an address in Alexandria, Virginia, and not Topeka, Kansas. And that's a problem for them. Another metric is by understanding how much they're doing for the state financially, fiscally, in terms of budgeting. There's legislative value to earmarks, and this gets back to the core of the talk. It helps build coalitions. It's a type of vote buying, which some people are appalled by, but it exists. It exists in business, this type of model. It exists in regular everyday life, and it exists in legislative coalitions. In order to get those last few votes you need for a majority or a supermajority, sometimes you need to play politics and offer money to the right states. That's part of the reason why small states do so well in terms of federal funding, because they're cheaper to buy off. So imagine how many earmarks it would take to move Dianne Feinstein or Barbara Boxer, senators from California. There's a lot of people in that state. The needs in that state are enormous, and it costs a lot of money. Now imagine trying to buy the same 2 votes, but from the senators in Montana or Nevada or other small states. It's a lot cheaper of a sell. So small states do quite well. And that's how you build coalitions. And as you build coalitions and you build majorities and you get legislation passed, it helps break gridlock. Why? Because it forces senators to negotiate, to coordinate, to communicate, to work together, to get to understand each other's states. It's true in the House, it's more so true in the Senate. In bringing these people together, who often who don't talk unless there's a vote on the Senate floor, which there aren't many of anymore, that has an important social dynamic, which can't be overstated, the social dynamics within a legislative chamber. Earmarks help force that and help grease the wheels, as John was saying before. It also links legislators by similar interests, by similar efforts, and not just because they have a D or an R after their name. What a senator in a place like Nevada has to deal with, he has a lot of rural land. He has constituents in underdeveloped places in the north and in central Nevada. And then he has an urban area in southern Nevada as well. Well, in that way, a senator from, Senator Heller, for instance, can probably understand what Senator Menendez from New Jersey is facing. New Jersey is the most population-dense state in the United States. It also has a huge gaming industry there. So now Dean Heller, a Republican from a state in the West, is going to be forced to understand what some of the needs are of a liberal like Bob Menendez from the East Coast. And how are those linked? By commerce, by causes, by the economics within those states that earmarking can help, because to respond to those policy needs, funding is the way to do it, or funding is one way to do it. There are budgetary values in earmarks. You have clear divisions of how the pie is being split up, and you can have, though it was not always this way with earmarking, you can have a clear understanding of who's doing the dividing and who's benefiting. You can actually have incentives to limit budget growth. And so this is a little bit counterintuitive. But if you're dividing up the money individually within Congress, then you're aggregating, you're putting this money together under a certain chairman's mark, and you say this cabinet department has, $57 billion to spend in the next fiscal year. So let's divide it up. However, if you get rid of earmarks and every state has to go through competitive processes to get these states, it's actually in Congress's interest to grow that budget so that then their state has a better opportunity to get the funding because there's more funding to go around, which doesn't necessarily happen if you're dividing the money up yourself. It also motivates congressional oversight. If Congress is picking who's getting money, they want to make sure they're getting their money. They want to make sure that money's being spent right. And in an era in which Congress is getting rid of its oversight duties unless there's a big, flashy, sexy scandal to investigate, they don't care. And that's a real democratic problem, and it's a real budgetary problem too, because mistakes are made in bureaucracy, and you typically now only find them once it blows up into a real problem. See the recent VA scandal. So what's the fallout of the earmark ban? I've sort of hinted at this along the way. In the legislative branch, it can really slow or stop legislative productivity. There are fewer bills have been passed in this Congress than any other Congress since the New Deal. Congress isn't doing anything. Now, some of you might think that's a good thing, but there are things that Congress needs to do every year, like fund the government. This time last year, a government shutdown started. On this day last year, we had a government shutdown started for 17 days. That was because Congress could not even decide to fund the government. That's a problem. That tends not to happen in an environment with earmarks in it. The earmark ban also puts less attention on the appropriations process. Rather than going agency by agency, department by department, figuring out what money will be spent, where it will be spent, what programs need more money, what programs maybe need less money, what programs need to be tweaked a little bit. The way Congress funds the government is they say, we're going to do exactly what we did last year, plus or minus 1%. That's no way to run a railroad. That's not how you run a business. If the casinos here in town ran that way, and said, well, we're not going to introduce new games. We're not going to introduce new slots. We're not going to introduce little new side bets that are working out. We're not going to reorganize what our casinos look like so that people are coming in and they're staying longer. We're not going to do any of that. We're not going to learn from the mistakes. You're going to have a lot of casinos that are hurting. If casinos or any business just said, we're just going to keep doing what we did last year, plus or minus 1%. There are really serious implications for business in that sense, and there's really serious implications when a government does that too. As I said earlier, the earmark ban stifles cooperation and coordination. It makes it so members don't work together anymore. It gives them one less reason to work together. Typically, the earmark ban, or by most accounts, the earmark ban has had no effect on budgets or deficits. Budgets keep growing. Deficits are shrinking, not because of the earmark ban, but because taxes have been raised and other areas of government spending have dropped. And it also weakens Congress's constitutional role, as I talked about earlier. The earmark ban does empower the president. It empowers the nearly 4,000 political appointees. It empowers the unelected bureaucracy. This is what's interesting about an earmark ban. An earmark ban is oftentimes trumpeted by Republicans, more so than Democrats, and there are a lot of reasons why that makes sense. And so Congress will criticize earmarking as a really serious problem. So they transfer all that power to the bureaucracy and to the president and to the rest of the executive branch. And then they criticize unelected bureaucrats for making policy decisions. Well, it's either going to be elected officials or unelected officials who are going to do it, and it's really in Congress's interest for them to be the elected officials. It's senseless, but if it made sense, it wouldn't be Congress. It dramatically reduces transparency as well. And that's a real problem. What goes on in a federal agency is very difficult to understand. I had to write a book and research for 5 years to figure out how federal funding works in a politicized arena. Well, most people don't do that, and I don't recommend it. It's boring, frankly, to sit and talk to appointees day in and day out, to sit and talk to interest group leaders day in and day out, to ask them, how does this work? What I call the black box wrapped in red tape. How does this work? It's a little easier to understand how it works in Congress. And so something else that makes very little sense is this idea that there's a problem with transparency when we do congressional earmarks, so let's have the bureaucracy do it. Well, there's no transparency, there's very little transparency there. And obviously it dramatically affects what political scientists have called the basic question in politics of who gets what and when. Earmark bans can also hurt states. It doesn't just hurt Congress, it doesn't just hurt elected officials, but it can really substantially hurt states. State need varies. What Nevada needs isn't necessarily what Connecticut needs, either in terms of scope, policy area, or amount. But state capacity varies even more. And so what I mean by state capacity is the ability of a state government, legislative branch or executive branch, the ability of municipalities or counties to apply for funds, to get through a bureaucratic process. I talk a lot in my research, obviously, about federal funding, and Nevada is one of the worst states in the country in terms of getting federal funding, and part of the reason for that is that the capacity of the state to get things done is lower than other states that have a full-time legislature, that invest heavily in state government. A lot of those states tend to be in New England, and those states do pretty well for what they need. They also pay a lot in taxes, but they also get a lot back. As I said, some states in that sense struggle with competitive processes. When you have to compete for grant funding through a bureaucracy, the ability of your state to do that can really limit how much you get. Earmarks overcome that. Earmarks are directives to say this state or this city or this town is going to get this money, regardless of the processes by which they apply. They're going to get these funds. Typically, they have to ask for them, but they're set for them. So if you have a state that struggles in this area, earmarking can help that. And in that sense, the earmark ban can really hurt Nevada. So what's the importance for congressional earmarks in this state? First, you can get direct help from the congressional delegation. You have the Senate Majority Leader here, which should serve as a real benefit. He should really be able to earmark. He has almost absolute control over what gets voted on. That's tremendous power. He has that, and the Speaker of the House has that. There are very few exceptions to Senator Reid and Speaker Boehner's ability to schedule legislation. That's important, because if you want your legislation scheduled, maybe you have to give Senator Reid or Speaker Boehner a little something in return, or someone that Senator Reid would like to have something in return. So that should help in a chamber that has earmarks. You also have 2 members of the House majority. In the House of Representatives, the majority does everything. The minority has no power, almost no power. So having House members who are Republicans would be helpful right now. It would be more helpful right now if you allowed earmarks. And because the Republicans will continue to be in the majority after the election, that will continue. You also have one House member who's in a swing district. He's in a competitive district, Joe Heck. That's important because when Congress used to earmark funds, they certainly, especially in the House, especially the majority party in the House, they would take a look out and say, who needs help this election cycle? Who might win by 1%? Joe Heck. He normally faces tough races, at least in what he's run so far. And so he has an opportunity to capitalize on that in an environment with earmarks, but he doesn't without one. It also helps Senator Reid outside of just direct transfers of federal funding. It helps him move legislation. It helps him, as I said, vote buying, which is sort of a pejorative term for coalition building. And the more that Senator Reid gets to move legislation, it at least increases his opportunity to bring things back to Nevada. It's not to say it always will, that every piece of legislation that the senator moves is going to help Nevada. But it at least increases the number of opportunities if he's able to move bills. And it's not just Senator Reid. So coalition building, as I say, is difficult in any legislature, but it's really difficult in the US Senate because of supermajority requirements, because individual senators do have quite a bit of power in the US Senate relative to the House, relative to most state legislatures, relative to most parliaments and the Congresses in the world. The US Senate is a unique institution, as you all know, and it makes the life of the Senate Majority Leader that much more difficult, especially relative to the House Speaker. Although this House Speaker has a particularly horrendous job, given who is in his conference, but in the Republican conference. But Senator Reid doesn't have much of a better one because of the rules of the Senate. And so earmarking really helps Senate leaders and others in the Senate to, as I said, build these coalitions and move legislation. Senate leaders tend to hail from small states. If you think back to the last few that we've had, the one exception is Bill Frist. He comes from what would be considered an average-sized state, a median-sized state in Tennessee, but Tom Daschle from South Dakota, Bob Dole from Kansas, even Mitch McConnell, who there's a chance he'll be a Senate Majority Leader starting in January, he comes from a relatively small state too. There's reasons for that. You're able to build power, you tend to stay there for longer, and in times past, you were one of the coalition builders because you had a small state that could easily be bought off, and you ended up becoming a power broker and a power player. And these senators, so small states tend to give us Senate leaders who really need earmarks to get their jobs done. So earmarks are a really beneficial way of moving forward. It's not going to fix everything in Congress, but I argue that Congress really needs to eliminate the earmark ban, and they need to do it now. But they need to reform it. As I said at the beginning of the talk, the idea of an earmark ban as a yes or no proposition is false, and it's stupid, and it's bad public policy. And I don't recommend just putting earmarks back in as they were before, because they did have problems. I recommend reforming the process, increasing transparency. So every time an earmark is placed in a bill, you know who placed it there and who the recipient was. Whether it's an individual, whether it's a city or town or state government, whether it's a business, whatever it is, you understand who benefits. Transparency is going to help quite a bit in terms of reducing corruption, just because the elected official knows that if they screw up, if they start engaging in corrupt activity, it's easy for the public and it's easy for the media to figure it out. Also ban earmarking when conflicts of interest are present. If you're earmarking funds that help your business or help property of yours, or in any way that conflicts of interest exist. If they benefit a company that your wife works for, or your husband works for, or your children work for, these are things that need to be addressed. And it's important to address them and make them part of the earmarking process, the new earmarking process. Engage the public, talk to the public, have an informed conversation about what earmarks are, what benefits they can offer, what challenges and risks they offer as well. But talk to the public in a legitimate way, not just vilifying what they are. And empower the appropriations committees. Get Congress back to appropriating. Earmarks allow that to happen. It allows the people who are charged with making spending decisions, helping structure agencies, helping determine how much money programs are going to have. It helps those committees get back to the work that they had been doing for decades, and that they're not doing anymore. So earmarks are a small price for an improved legislative environment. The current legislative environment is terrible. It's as bad as it has ever been in the United States, but by a lot of metrics. I have a colleague back at Brookings, Sarah Binder, who's one of the best Congress scholars in the country. She argues that while it may not be as bad as it can get, it's pretty bad. Legislative productivity is poor. Relations within Congress, my meetings with congressional staff, with House members, with senators, they're fed up with it and they don't know how to fix it themselves. This is a fix. As I said, it won't fix anything, but it absolutely can't make things worse in Congress. And if you can get a little bit of benefit out of this process, it's better than where we're at now. And that's it. I'm going to have Bill come back down, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Nice and warm up here.
We've got time for a couple of questions if you want to challenge John or agree with John. John?
Is there anybody, to be honest with you, before I came to this lecture, I thought, oh, this is crazy. But you convinced me that this is a good idea. Is there anybody else on your side on this, John?
So as I said, Senator Inhofe likes the idea of bringing earmarks back. There are some senators in safe seats who are comfortable coming out and saying this is something that we really miss and we've made a mistake here. We're seeing the light. And so, obviously there are a lot of Democrats who want it back too. The Democrats who initially were in favor of earmarks. So yeah, there are a lot of people. The House too. The House does this quite a bit, and there are some powerful committee chairs who really miss it. Republican committee chairs who really miss it. And so there is a movement in there, but there's a counter movement too. Senator Coburn, who we were discussing earlier, Senator Coburn, the other senator from Oklahoma, he puts out every year the Waste Book. And in my opinion, there's no bigger waste than the Waste Book. It mischaracterizes federal funding in ways that make really important research projects or funding initiatives look silly. Now, there are some items in his Waste Book that probably need addressing and probably need to be reconsidered. But there are a lot of things that don't in there, and that's a real problem. So he sees this as such a serious problem that he will make comments, which he has in the past, like any Republican who wants to bring the earmarking ban back is going to get a primary from a Republican. So that disincentivizes people to come out and deal with this issue in a legitimate way because it just makes political villainy out of a really complex issue. It simplifies a really complex issue. So there are reasons why I would argue there are probably more Republicans who want earmarks back than they're willing to go on record as saying because of the primary risks. And that's a legitimate concern on their part, but it's one that's holding things up.
Would you separate, in order to reduce earmark, the bad side of earmarks?
Sure.
I think earmarks have a tendency to kind of move representative legislation to game playing. I'll scratch your back if you scratch my back.
Absolutely.
So a representative from a rural area that has very conservative, doesn't want gun control, but because they want to play the game in order to stay in Congress, has to vote with the legislator from an urban area who maybe is more liberal and says, we want more gun control. Would you propose excluding legislative bills from earmarks in the sense of removing that incentive or disincentive to lie to your constituents or even turn your back on your platforms?
Sure. So that's an important distinction. There are a lot of ways to slip earmarks into bills. Some of them have nothing to do with spending. And I think that's what you're talking about. If you have a bill that, let's say, wants to an assault weapons ban, all right, there will probably be some funding in an assault weapons ban bill for the FBI to do what they need to enforce it, for the Department of Justice to enforce the new law. But that's not a spending bill. That's a substantive bill. And attaching earmarks to that, you know, a corn subsidy or something to that for farmers, that's inappropriate. That's not how this game should work. But that said, it's not, that perspective is limited in the sense that it sees the legislative process as a very individual and discrete process, that we're passing this bill and that has nothing to do with any other bills. So the way in prior times, the way this would work is, I need your vote on this, I'll give you my vote on that, put an earmark in that, and you have my support. So oftentimes, while those earmarks do slip into substantive bills that are inappropriate, that vote buying goes on in more complex networks of the legislative process. That said, on an issue like gun control, but that's just one, but substantive issues in general, the legislator has a really important choice to make. There's a principle there, if you're very much in favor of the written word of the Second Amendment, and you want very limited gun control, you have to make the choice between, if you have to make a choice between a bridge and gun laws, that's a choice you have to make. It's a tough choice, but we're not sending people to Congress to make just easy choices. And so I think on impassioned areas, social issues in general, you're probably not going to be able to buy votes. And if you're able to buy votes, and the public is unhappy, you got a chance to put them out in 2 years or in 6 years. And so in that sense, I think that not every vote can be bought and not on every bill. And so I think in that sense, earmarks should not really affect legislation like that where it's putting people in horrible positions where they have to vote against their principles.
Sir? How about right in front here first?
Thank you. My question is about the Appropriations Committee. Would they become obsolete if we had an earmarks ban? It seems like that would...
So they have become obsolete. Not just because of the earmarks ban. The Appropriations Committees have become largely obsolete because we don't pass spending bills in the same way that we used to. We pass some now, but we've gone years without spending any, without passing any. This, what's called a continuing resolution, where you say we're going to fund the government at the same rate as last year, either at the same rate or plus or minus a certain percent, that's making the appropriations process obsolete. What I think is the removal of the earmark ban should be a process, should be a decision that is made in concert with strengthening the appropriators again, to getting them back to the job of actually going through and making funding decisions.
Still have a question, sir?
So what happens when the ban lifts?
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's two schools of thought immediately to me. One is you know, you look at like the federal ban on execution.
Mm-hmm.
You know, opponents said, well, as soon as the ban's lifted, you know, it's going to be a march to death.
Mm-hmm.
And that didn't happen. In fact, people had come off, states had come out of the habit and practice of executing prisoners, and it took a while to get so is that what, you know, so I guess my question very specifically is, you know, if I'm a Republican running in and facing a primary,
mm-hmm.
and earmarks open back up, I would think there's got to be a rush for me to do two things. Get some earmarks so I can go back in my primary and
mm-hmm.
say, look, earmarks aren't the devil. We've got these new facilities, schools, grants, programs, or whatever, and, you know, and so, you know, is that likely to happen? What, I mean, is it a floodgate for a little while, or what's the deal when it lifts?
So to speculate, there will be quite a bit of earmarking if it lifts. I would be shocked if there weren't. But your point is a good one. Not everyone can earmark, like not every senator, not every House member can engage in earmarking and get away with it. If you're a conservative member from a very conservative state or district more so than state, it's tough because you're going to face that primary. And some people can beat back a primary pretty easily. Others are really at risk. And so that's a challenge that that individual elected official is going to have to face. That said, in general, everyone hates earmarks except for their own. And so you would be shocked at how quickly you can convert a Tea Party voter about how important the new firehouse is to their town, even if it was a transfer of federal funding. And that's not a criticism of the Tea Party, it's a just basic reality of they understand their local need, and you don't think earmarks are a bad thing when you can see that they're a good thing. And I think that's true of a lot of issues in politics right now, but it's also true in earmarking. So in that sense, yeah, there are going to be former earmark masters who are going to go right back to work. Southern senators, for instance, are going to do quite well with that. Some Northeastern senators, too, for that matter. I'm from Connecticut originally. Chris Dodd was pretty good with earmarks, and we had senators before him, Lowell Weicker, others, were pretty good at helping our state out, especially in areas of defense. And so, yeah, there's, like I said, it's not going to be even. Not everyone's going to behave differently, nor should they. But that's important in itself because it's a responsiveness to your constituent interests and your constituent demands.
I want to get us out of here on time, but John will be around if I haven't had a chance to get to you have a question. Thanks for your attention. I want to invite you back in a couple weeks. Our next lecture is not next week, but on October 15th. A colleague will be back out, Adele Morris, and we'll have an environmental topic. We'll be discussing the new federal regulations on greenhouse gases and how that affects power plants and the environment, and she'll talk specifically about Nevada as well. So if you have time, I hope you'll join us. Thanks again for coming.
Thank you.